Well, good day, Dzień dobry Państwu, and welcome to the latest in a series of webinars hosted by the Polish American Historical Association. My name is Neil Pease. I am the current president of PAHA, and we're delighted to have you with us today, our members and friends, both from the Americas and from Europe. And we have a special treat for us today. We have a presentation by Dr. Anna Mazurkiewicz, and the subject is The Voice of the Silenced Peoples in the Global Cold War, the Assembly of Captive European Nations, 1954 and 1972. That's the title of her most recent book, and the subject of talk today is drawn from that, and it is America, Exiles, and Ways to Rally Global Support for the Case of Captive Nations During the Cold War. The way we'll proceed is this. I will make an introduction of Professor Mazurkiewicz and the two commentators, and then Professor Mazurkiewicz will make her presentation with PowerPoint, and that will be followed by two sections of commentary, which should leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. When we get to that point, then please feel free either to enter a question in the chat, or if it's more convenient, simply to speak up, and we can handle that. And we will plan to end in about an hour. Let's see, is there any other preliminary before that needs saying due to my faulty memory, or can we go ahead with the introductions? All right. Our main speaker today is Professor Anna Mazurkiewicz, who is a Dr. Habilitowany at the Institute of History at the University of Gdansk in Poland. Among her many distinctions, she is a past president of the Polish American Historical Association, and she is the recipient of the association's Hyman Medal for lifetime contributions to the study of Polish Americans in the Polish diaspora. She is a winner of the organization's Halecki Book Award, and she is an awardee of the Swastek Prize for the best article in a given volume of the association's journal, Polish American Studies. We have the pleasure of having as a commentator on Dr. Mazurkiewicz's presentation, Dr. Sławomir Łukasiewicz, who is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at the Institute of European Studies at the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin, Poland, and he is a visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and East European Studies at Harvard University. The second commentator will be, me. And my name is Neil Pease. And again, I am current president of the Polish American Historical Association and professor emeritus of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And again, a hearty welcome to all of us. We're looking forward to a very stimulating hour. And with that, Anya, it is all yours. Please remember to mute yourselves if you are not speaking.
Neil, thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the ability to be able to share my work, a work of love, as always, as things goes with writing a book. I really appreciate all of you joining PAHA today. Of course, my first and foremost organization, academic home, and a hub for academic and personal friendships. I really appreciate all of you being here. I will share my screen now. because I want to follow a plan that I have prepared for today. And also I want to keep you entertained so that I wouldn't bore you with details. I want to share the story of why the book and how it came into being. How did I end up addressing global issues when working on a relatively small organization that was called the Assembly of Captive European Nations. I say relatively small, 160 people approximately when we talk about membership. Prominent former leaders, political leaders, people who are members of establishment in the countries of the region, 9 countries that Americans denoted as Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, as the exiles were arguing, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and the 3 Baltic states annexed by the Soviet Union, whose annexation the United States government did not recognize. So the topic for the book that I want to tell you more about today is the Assembly of Captive European Nations, an organization that I came to know more about in 2005 and 2006. I was fascinated by the story of a multi-ethnic entity, representation of East Central Europe in the form of an umbrella organization uniting prominent former politicians in the United States. Later, I found out under the aegis of the Free Europe Committee, that means in close symbiotic, as I call it in the book, relationship with the United States government. So the topic of the book is basically the Assembly of Captive European Nations, the organization that was consisted of 9 national councils and committees composed of the exiles from the region, representatives, delegates of 5 party internationals, and other affiliated organizations in exiles, which had minuscule impact. The most important, the core membership, are the national delegates of the councils and committees in exiles and the 5 party international. So that's basically the focus of the book. Now, obviously, the first question when I'm beginning to introduce my story to you is to answer the question on what exactly was the ACEN, because the fact that I just described the membership does not really tell the whole story. So, you know, from the very early days when I started working on this organization, I realized that what was the ACEN depends on whom you ask. And according to its members, I'm going to read a little passage from the book. According to its members, and this quote comes from the first session of the ACN, this is September 1954, the ACN was a forum in which the common view and aspirations of the silenced peoples of the once free and independent nations could be forcefully voiced in the free world, meant to serve the cause of liberation of Central and Eastern European nations, to become an authoritative source of information on conditions created by the Soviet domination and communist rule in the captive nations, a fountainhead of constructive ideas, promoter of courses of action, which would enable the free world to help the enslaved peoples to help themselves and thus further their own vital interest to attain a world order based on freedom and justice for men and nations, to counter communist propaganda, to supply the free world delegates in the UN with factual information on issues of special concern to captive nations, and finally, to remind the free world of its vital stake in the cause of free Central and Eastern Europe. Well, that's official documents. And of course, I could read more from the charter, from the rules, but it gets more interesting when you are actually trying to understand how did the members of the ACN, the leadership of the organization, actually understand the role of the ACN. So Vilis Masens, a Latvian leader, longtime chairman of the organization, would say that this was an exile organization speaking in one voice for almost 100 million silenced people. So the 9. As defined by the American guidance. East Central European Cooperation Platform. This is the longtime secretary Felix Gadomski, who proposes that the exiles came together to strengthen their voice, basically, in the West. When we read Stefan Kolboński's words, the man who actually led me into the topic, led me into the organization, I followed his life story, and this is how I ended up being totally overwhelmed by the history of the ACEN. He said that according to his opinion and his outlook, ACEN was an alternative to the communist representatives in the UN, a legitimate representation of the captives in the free world. So later we will find out in the New York Times that indeed even the American press would pick the notion that ACEN was the little UN. And then we might want to pay attention to what Janos Horvat, a young exile, a 56er from Hungary, would call it when he joined, a quasi-East European parliament. So he put more focus, more attention on the internal dynamics and how these people would try to negotiate their position within the assembly. So you can already see that, you know, different people with different experience of different national and ethnic background would see it differently. It gets even more interesting when you are trying to see the interpretation of what was the ACEN, when you look from the perspective, from the point of view of the sponsor of the organization. I'm going to tell you much more about the sponsor in a moment, but for now, let's get the story right. So what was the ACEN? Free Europe Committee and the people who oversaw its operation would call it an American propaganda agency, and people in it are not free. Initially, in the CIA memorandums, we might find information saying that they were supposed originally to offer advice on broadcasting policy and serve as a point of reference, offering legitimacy to the Free Europe Committee and Radio Free Europe operations. Very soon thereafter, it turns out that the documents which are available at the Hoover Institution will point us to the different directions, saying ACEN basically kept the frustrated East European exiles busy, as not to interfere with American politics. Finally, by 1963, we might read that American sponsors would call it in their internal memorandums, this is not official knowledge, a body to which US officials and leading citizens could address expressions of sympathy for Eastern Europe and assurances of eventual change. So it is like almost like a safe security valve where, if you have a frustrated congressman, well, here's this organization, write them a letter, show your support, and they will very much appreciate, and you will feel, and your constituents will be appreciating of you feeling a little bit better of having done something in your anti-communist struggle. Now, starting with existing literature and preliminary archival searches, looking for the way to understand why would Americans, sponsor these organizations, and how does the Free Europe Committee fit into the much larger picture of the state-private network and American government engaging in helping the exiles. Well, I must tell you that even if you look through the official documentation, through the official files, the confusion is not decreasing. So first, here is the official speech. This is the Freedom Day. It's July 1956, Liberty Island. And then we have the representative of the Free Europe Committee, Houston, coming to the podium and saying that the exiles are the warriors of freedom, that they are in need in American support, but they are the gallant fighters in the humanities struggle against communism. Then you go into, the Presidential Library of President Eisenhower, you look at the papers of his chief political warfare advisor, C.D. Jackson, and suddenly you find out that this is not the story, that the ACEN was basically a mere tool used to advance a much larger goal. And then finally you go into the classical, basically the starting point for any researcher doing American foreign policy, so that is the foreign relations of the United States. And in the official policy paper, you find information that it was the exile leaders who joined forces in 1954, created ACEN, and through their actions and deliberations, they have been able to attract a more serious attention of the US and foreign press free world statesmen, and they have become to date the most effective device of the Eastern European political exiles to exercise influence. That's the key word for today. And expound their views before public opinion outside and within the Iron Curtain. So what we're dealing with here is an organization that, as I have explained in the article that Neil so kindly mentioned, the one that is published in the Polish American Studies on the origins of the ACN, Join or Die, I called it. The exiles were pushed and pressed into creating the ACN by the Free Europe Committee, which is not evident in this paper. And once created, they joined in the system within which, sponsored covertly by the CIA, supervised, overseen, and using the guidelines coming from the State Department, they were put to work politically, being engaged with the UN, with the Council of Europe, with the Free World Government, being put on, I'm going to tell you much more about this in a moment, on the world tours, lecture tours, being sponsored in their publications by the same sources to influence public opinion, to advance American goals. But the same happened within the United States. So we are like in this vicious cycle where we have the government using this front organization to influence the opinions so that then the American public would be informed along the lines that the government wants. When it comes to Congress, which I describe in the book, it is particularly interesting because rather than having a check on the government, they are being influenced by this bypass way of using the exile voices. Now, when it comes to the importance and the meaning of the exile operations, in this book, I have decided that I should follow the lead of the Free Europe Committee because influencing the American public was not the main goal and not the main reason why the ACN was maintained for as many years as it existed under the aegis of the Free Europe Committee, which is 1954 to 1972. It was the non-committed, the global South, the developing world, that the exiles were were discovered to be most useful. Free World Operations Divisions within the Free Europe Committee was the office which put them to work. And here's a document which explains as to what was the Free Europe Committee's thinking about how ACN and the exile political organizations might be useful to them. So here is, agreed policy governing Free Europe. And of course, we know that Free Europe is not only the organization, state-private entity that sponsors ACN, national councils and committees. It also sponsors the most important, the most influential, and the most costly project, that of Radio Free Europe. They also run a number of different projects. They sponsor 64 different organizations. They have their own entities, which I don't have time really to talk about today. In regards to the exiled political leaders, what the Free Europe Committee should, okay, when you read the title of a paper that says agreed policy, that means that the Free Europe Committee had to negotiate it with the advisory board, which usually means State Department, and with the executive committee, which usually means the CIA. So what did they agree on under point 2H? Utilize outstanding and appropriately selected exile leaders in the underdeveloped areas of the world, including Latin America, to explain the nature of Soviet colonialism and to give eyewitness accounts of the techniques which the Soviets used to take over control of another country. Similarly, such exiles should attend international meetings, should participate in international organizations, should write articles in publications, and otherwise attempt to influence important opinion molders towards the above objectives. So I was totally hooked because for me, my way of contextualizing exile activities would always be based on the assumption that Americans were supporting the exiles to advance their goals by supporting opposition behind the Iron Curtain, by maintaining hope, maintaining dissent behind the Iron Curtain. But here I found out that what they were mostly employed, asked, and steered to do was to get engaged with the non-committed or weak in terms of supporting the American global policy agenda regions. So I started thinking along different lines when I was thinking about how to write this book. I came up with sort of thesis that I tried to put together, because on the one hand, I thought that the exiled political leaders could be interpreted, could be seen as a surrogate for domestic opposition, especially in 1950s. In the post-Stalinist period, we really have hardly any organized opposition in East Central Europe across the region. On the other hand, reading these documents, especially from the intelligence people, I found out that basically ACN was established after all the major programs have already been either completed or compromised or sabotaged or just backfired. After 1953, Americans are not seriously considering any major action behind the Iron Curtain. So ACN, when it does come into being, it's a way to keep the exiles in the blue suit, to use Kurt Meyer's language, the man who was responsible for international organizations in the CIA. Then I was thinking that maybe I should take on the thesis about the ACN being a Cold War front, and Americans, fast learning how to confront the Soviet propaganda and the way that they were rallying support around the world. Maybe this was a response. So American-led political engagement to use the exiles in the international forum to explain why America needs to act. On the other hand, I was tempted to examine the possibility that maybe the political exiles agreed to all of that because they were hoping that they'll come up with a political lobby. Well, in America, if you want to become a lobbyist, if you want to have an influence, you better be a citizen, or you better have a following in certain regions, in districts. So this would mean that the exiles might have needed the support of the ethnic groups, respective ethnic groups, which I know was not the case, not necessarily to the extent that would have any kind of following, any kind of impact, measurable impact. So then I thought, well, maybe it was just an instrument, just a sheer propaganda asset for the Free Europe Committee. Then reading through the ACN files, another idea that I tried to follow, another thesis that I created, was that it was indeed a united representation, speaking in one voice, and as such presenting the East Central European point of view, already coined and already framed in sometimes very lengthy and sometimes very nasty discussions, so as to present the point of view that would not be dependent on Moscow's directive. So independent voice of united delegation of people who would have been in power. Don't get me wrong, these people who are members of the General Committee of the ACN, the members who are speaking on behalf of their countries, they are not people who were chosen by accident. Oftentimes they were handpicked and selected by the Americans and steered into joining the initiatives that I'm describing to you today. Well, the main problem I want to attack today, I don't want to talk about what's in the book. I want to tell you why I wrote the book and what is the driving force behind my search for the answer related to the question that I love most of all the questions I always ask, and my students always laugh when I say this, because my ultimate question on any project that I'm working on is always, and so what? Okay. They came together, they worked, they got the money, they traveled, and so what? Okay, what is the result of their actions? And I remember during one of the conferences, Professor Anna Jagoszyńska-Kirschman asked me the very, not the very same, but very similar question. So how do you make sense of what was their impact? So there were three ways that I decided this organization can be approached. One is to look at its relationship with the sponsors. So the US state private network and the political exiles from the region. So although both are multilateral entities, I'm combining them, looking at this moment when they join forces. So it's mostly a bilateral approach that I'm discussing here. Well, that's one way. But then the other way to talk about the ASEAN would be really to focus on its transnational character and to relate it to the global Cold War. Why transnational? Because it's not only a multi-ethnic, multinational organization that works on international arena, it works within the American global policies, and it works in Europe, it works in the United States, it works, although indirectly, towards the captive Europe, it works in the global South. So it's present in the international relations with national borders crossed on multiple levels in a truly transnational effort, which is the fascinating story covered in the book. And then there's one other way, extremely important and extremely difficult at the same time, because there's also an area that we could look at, and that is the internal dynamics within the international representation. So the 9 delegates of political exiles from 9 East Central European countries. So how did they negotiate their joint united position? Because most of the resolutions that were adopted by the ASEAN were adopted without a dissenting voice. And that was not easy. Remember, you had Poles and Czechs, Hungarians and Romanians and Bulgarians. This is a long story of past grievances and very difficult political positions that these people had to sometimes take. So for the first option, so the bilateral approach, I tried it. And the book that I wrote was published in 2016. With the help and assistance of the immigration program run and chaired at the time by Professor Mazurkiewicz. I wanted to write the book that would start in 1948 and would end in 1989. There were supposed to be 8 chapters. And, you know, after I have completed page number 500, I decided that probably this book should end in 1954, because by the time I was done explaining the system, American system established to take on the exiles and create this whole machinery to put them within the elaborate system that was created after the Second World War, based on George Kennan's original idea of March 1948. I decided that simply I cannot keep on going and focusing on just one organization. So this very first book that talks about bilateral relations, how does the United States establish the system of combining the state and the private and coming together with the exiles and using them to advance America's strategic goals? Well, the project was complete and the system was in place. And as I said, by 1952, 1953, it was, bluntly obvious when you read the documents from the era that basically any sort of thinking about engagement in the region was out of questions. And of course, this is in the context of the East German uprising and the rebellion in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech part. But in 1954, what we have already in place, it's a well-functioning system already with Radio Free Europe operating broadcasting, because Iron Curtain is definitely not soundproof despite the efforts to jam it. We have a very special case, Free Europe Committee, encompassing cooperation from the Department of State, where we have the policy planning staff, Office of Public Affairs and Office of Intelligence Research, combined with the resources coming from the CIA in the early period from the Office of Policy Coordination. But the committee does not operate in secrecy. It's not a covert operation. Free Europe Committee is rallying the support of the American people. It's a committee that features its board with, basically a list of who is who in America of the era. We have people who are representatives of the media world, former diplomats, presidents of the foundations, representatives of big and well-known American companies who are giving their last names to the committee to support whatever it is doing to combat world communism. Within the system, there appears the program to support political exiles. And when we think about their role within the much larger design, much larger project, what we see is that for the exiles, the emergence of these psychological, Kennan calls it political warfare plans, means that there's plenty of opportunities for them because no other country would put so much money, so much effort, and such unequivocal support behind their agenda. So there's opportunity, and it's interesting that it's most commonly the Americans who worked for the Free Europe Committee who would call it a partnership with the exiles than the exiles themselves. It was a particular partnership which allowed the exiles to continue their political activity. They were limited. They had to register with American authorities because they were not becoming citizens of the United States. So they had to register as foreign agents. They didn't know it officially, but they assumed that it was the American government who was paying their bills. And some of them later actually said that they were pretty sure that intelligence was behind this as well. What was dangerous to their political activities, talking about the exiles right now, was the fact that they were vulnerable to the American foreign policy shifts because they depended on the American support. They were also vulnerable to the internal divisions and splits and arguments. And so there were both incentives, and money was I think, the least important of these, but there were also the hazards of engaging with the Americans. For the hosts, there were plenty of opportunities. Of course, because the exiles knew the region, had their contacts, were able to prepare reports, spoke the languages, understood the legal economic systems, and engaging them would provide with the knowledge. But engaging the exiles was also, entering this partnership was also a way to legitimize America's involvement. Look, these are the people, they sought our help, and we are doing it on their behalf for their freedom, okay? Well, there's a problem because America, except for breaking the relations with Albania and briefly breaking the relations with Bulgaria, and except for never recognizing the annexations of the Baltic states, all the other countries that I have listed were recognized by Washington. They had, diplomatic relations. So, there were limits of diplomacy. John Like told me it was very smart. On the one hand, they recognized the government. On the other hand, clandestinely, they were supporting the exiles. And there was also a problem that if Americans would not have engaged the exiles could have agitated the ethnics and thus cause a lot of trouble, especially to the Democratic Party. There were haphazards, there were dangers, because not always the exiles had the same interests as Americans at a given time. And also it was, as I'm trying to prove in my book, control of the exiles was sometimes difficult. But why am I saying all of this? Because without the exiles, the whole system would not have worked. The exiles were an integral and indispensable part of the system that was established beginning in 1948. The system originally, at its origin, depended on the state of international relations. So it was rooted in the Yalta-Potsdam system, and it had its origin in the world, but it was directly related to American global agenda. It matched the American foreign policy goals. It was legitimizing American effort on behalf of the captive nations domestically. It facilitated American presence and made American voice more genuine in forums like the UN and Council of Europe. It provided a multi-ethnic, stronger voice for the exile organization. So it's already this international determinant of their operations. And later, when we see early emergence of opposition back in the East Central Europe, you can see how the need for supporting exile operations in the West decreases, and there is this phasing out or moving of the support closer to what is happening in East Central Europe. Now, one thing that still remains to be further advanced in research is the transnational heritage left behind by the exiles. So something that was created in exile based on their cooperation within the ASEAN, and it's still not fully exploited and projected back into the historiographies of the countries of the region. What is the intellectual, cultural, and, like Slavik writes, political thought legacy of their operations that was created in the conditions of exile. So based on the reasoning that there is much more to be researched when we move to the second stage, which is this transnational approach to what the ASEAN did as an entity and not by individual councils or committees, not by individual national groups, I decided to write this book focusing on specific projects, regions, and aspects of their operations. So my book is not really a story about the operations of the ASEAN from the moment that they inaugurated their operations in September 1954 to the moment when the financing is being withdrawn. And the ASEAN continues their operations until 1989, but without the official support of the Free Europe Committee. What I wanted to do is to tackle a very difficult task and approach the question of, so what? What does it mean that they were working with Americans? What did they do where we can actually see any sort of impact? So I looked at the Council of Europe. I looked at the approach or attempt to influence a situation behind the Iron Curtain. That was the case with the Poznan trials of the workers who protested in June 1956. I spent a lot of time thinking about how to frame American uses of the exiles on the doorstep of the United Nations. And I decided to focus on two case studies. One was preparing for action in regards to Poznan. The other one was the Hungarian Revolution, which was by far the single most important occurrence that defined ASEAN's political programs for many years to come. And then American Congress involvement in Asia, working with anti-communist organizations there. And then the one that was the most surprising for me as I was working on this chapter, ASEAN activities in Latin America, which also included purchasing hours on radio broadcasting stations across the continent. And finally, the conclusion, trying to explain the relationship between the exiles and the Free Europe Committee as using the traditional ways of looking at it as partnership, as symbiotic relationship, eventually coming to the conclusion that it's not an easy answer. I'm going to prepare my conclusion in a moment. Very briefly, because I can see that I was supposed to talk for 15 minutes and it's probably double that time already. So let me just show you why did I decide to go global with the ASEAN and why is it important to look at what they were doing abroad. This is ASEAN budget in 1960. And as you can see, we are beginning with publications which are published in a number of languages and distributed across Western Europe, across Latin America, predominantly these two regions. Then we see travel. Then we see overseas operations, close to 30%, and then the delegates. And with the delegates, I'm going to tell you and show you a map where they had their offices. When we would try to cut the publications in half, because some of this was distributed across the United States as well, we basically see that half of America's ASEAN's budget, I think more, but for now, let's keep it at a half, was dedicated to programs that were targeting audiences beyond the United States and definitely beyond East Central European audiences, which actually were never a prime target for ASEAN operations. I wanted to show you the different linguistic versions of their publications they have published. I also wanted to show you this medal. I have an image of it here. of recognition awarded to people politicians predominantly, who offered support to the ASEAN. This was issued 10 years since the Assembly's founding for freedom of the 9 countries. Many of American members of the American Congress, many of the European politicians would be bestowed by this honor of being recognized as the friends of the captive European nations. I told you that they had offices. It depended on how many political exiles you would find in the region. So there were different tiers. So you had delegations, representatives, offices, and correspondents distributed predominantly in Western Europe and Latin America. They also use their networks, using their ethnic, individual national networks in different regions of the world to obtain access to different governments. And when the need arrives, just, today is the 23rd of October, so maybe it would be a good moment to remind us of the Hungarian Revolution. In the aftermath of the fighting, the exiles started appealing to different governments to undertake immediate action in the UN Forum. And these axes mark all the responses that they have received. It's not whom they wrote to, it's the response that they have received. And oftentimes their response included instructions to the UN delegates to actually bring the case in this international forum. Couple pictures showing their trips, their activities in Asia, just to initiate maybe some questions. If you have any, I'll be happy to come back to. On the doorstep of the United Nations, if you want me to tell you a little bit about this poster and where it was located, I'll be happy to do so. This is a flag raising ceremony at Strasbourg, so the presence of the Council of Europe. And it all seems nice and sweet, and I keep talking about symbiotic relationship and partnership, but it wasn't always that easy. And sometimes the exiles crossed lines with what American government wanted. For example, when they attacked Khrushchev in front of the UN in 1960, when he returned to the United States, he came for the second time. So the moment Khrushchev showed up in New York on Manhattan, well, the poster by the exiles was veiled, supposedly for security reasons. There were other cases, from the heydays when John Foster Dulles would be meeting with the delegation of the ASEAN to September 1960, October 1960, as well, where representative of the Democratic Party and, the man who was organizing Kennedy's campaign, Senator Dodd, is addressing the exiles on the corner of the UN Plaza simply because they cannot display their messages to the American public and to the international visitors where they were renting their house. Now, the ASEAN was not allowed by law, by not being American citizens, to mingle, to interact, to try to influence American politics. But Free Europe, not directly, through Christopher Emmett, a very interesting person. I speak a little bit about him in the book. They were able to come up with the organization called the American Friends of Captive Nations. And Emmett, who is basically, this is mostly 1 or 2 men organization, the people whom you see here, some of the names you probably recognize, Walter Judd, Paul Douglas, you can see the leader of the Conference of Americans of Central and East European Descent, Monsignor John Balkunas. You probably know these names, but the organization was established by 1 man, plus the accountant, the treasurer. These people never hid the purpose of this organization, which was to help the ASEAN reach the American public. And whatever the ASEAN came up with, Emmett would make sure that this was projected upon the Democratic and Republican party platforms as they were getting ready for the elections. This is the 1964 case, but there's much more to indicate that American Friends of Captive Nations was established solely for the purpose to allow the ASEAN to reach the American public, which I started this discussion with. Okay, coming to conclusion. So what does my research actually tell me in terms of Americans working with the exiles, and where can we find evidence of their impact? Well, one thing that I definitely see as a recurring theme is that their operations, their actions, their programs, their publications contributed to legitimizing American global involvement, both at home to the domestic audiences and abroad. When Zbigniew Brzezinski answered my email very early in my research, he said that this was like 3-sentence long response, but very inquisitive. He said, political legitimacy of the United States sustaining from outside internal opposition to communism. That was the purpose of having organization that I'm talking about today in place. I do know that, you know, with 143 libraries in the world still having in their collections the ACN news is an interesting proof to the point that this was an information education center based in New York, on top of all the documentation they have examined in the Immigration History Research Center in Minneapolis, where their papers are stored. Yes, they were trying to be a captives lobby, especially in the UN and in the Council of Europe. But yes, the exiles were not vulnerable mere tools or instruments, as the language of the documents tells us. They used the Americans as well as means of getting funds for their project in order to further and advance their goals. Finally, final point, their cooperation that survived the withdrawal of American founding is a symbolic indication of ability of the East Central Europeans to cooperate, paving the way, one would hope, to the post-liberation integration. It was a forum where East Central European exiles were, you know, framing, coining, discussing these positions jointly to respond to the development and the changing tides of the Cold War. Now, this is the third theme that still requires further investigation, and that is the most challenging and the most difficult, the one that I couldn't ever do by myself. That's why I started working again in cooperation with Sławek Łukasiewicz, and within the program he was chairing, on trying to get scholars from the region to come together and combine these diverse different national perspectives and think about it together. Well, it turned out to be extremely difficult. None of us can venture into all the archives and read Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Polish at the same time. So we have decided to start with a handbook and look at the general migrations and patterns. And the handbook, the cover that you see right now, includes sections that specifically deal with political migration, because we were hoping that this would attract other scholars to join us. Only one, as far as I know, and that is Polly Hekila, working on the Estonians, is now in the final stages of working on the book that does have ACN in its story, and it's a story of how Estonians work with the ACN. As far as I know, nobody else is working on it right now. I am in search for impact. And I am still not finished with the ACN story, although the book is here for you to enjoy. I wonder if the people who actually read the book saw any particular contribution to the discussion on the exile impact during the Cold War and included in the volume. And with that, I would like to finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. Dr. Łukasiewicz, do you have comments to add?
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me to this great event. I have only 3 short, hopefully, remarks and one question maybe for Anya. First of all, I would like to stress, to emphasize that our interests in research were simultaneous interest since many, many years. I remember such conference in Wrocław 25 or I'm sorry, 15 years ago or even more, when we talked that this topic is great topic for a book. Then I remember next meetings in Lublin with your presentation about ACEN. It enabled me to cite your research in my first book, and I was sure, yes, that ACN deserves its biography. And of course, the problem was with dispersion of sources. I think it could be quite interesting also for the audience, yes, how you were gathering all the sources, traveling through the world, trying to find still living witnesses, simply gathering all the pieces into one picture. But I would like to say only very to say one thing, how to summarize your efforts and how to put your book within the chain of his word historiography, because I'm sure this is really great book. Probably everyone knows the book about Russian Revolution written by Richard Pipes. Richard Pipes wrote that it took him 10 years to gather all the materials and to write this fundamental book on Russian Revolution. I think that when you were working through 13 years, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm sure that your book is even better. Yes, and everyone should read this book. So once again, if you would share with us your impressions about gathering all the sources, meeting with the peoples, and maybe one more thing, maybe it would be interesting also for some further research. What do we know about perception of ACN in our countries here in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary? Do you think that it is interesting, let's say, direction we should do something into this? Maybe it is also for another project. You have this potential to share this, like the last book you mentioned, the handbook published by the Grutter, proved. So that's all I want to say. Once again, congratulations. Who wants to know more from my side, probably my review of your book will be published by Polish American Studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Łukasiewicz. I will keep my own remarks brief so as to allow time for questions from the audience. And Anya, there are 3 questions already in chat, if you would want to check that. Yes, the book is a spectacular achievement of exhaustive research and careful analysis. And there are 3 conclusions, main conclusions that I drew from reading it, that I won't go into detail because Anya touched or at least hinted at all of these. First of these is the complexity of the Cold War. It's very easy for us to caricature it as an opposition of 2 sides, as a bipolar communist versus non-communist, US versus Soviet. But Dr. Mazurkiewicz's book shows us just how many interests were involved and how these were not always synchronized. Second, she points out the advantages, but the corresponding disadvantages that the East European exiles had in their relationship with the United States, which was the indispensable partner. But American interests were not always the same as the primary interests of the East Central European exiles. And moreover, American policy would change over the course of the years during the Cold War. Last but not least, Dr. Mazurkiewicz's book reminds us how secondary, in a way, the countries of East Central Europe were to American containment policy during the Cold War, which, of course, was focused on containment, emphasizing holding the Soviet sphere of influence within its present post-World War II boundaries and opposing its expansion from that, trusting, as Kennan did, that in time, Soviet communism would simply implode of its own weakness. So in a sense, and you increasingly see this in the story of ACEN, you move from an American emphasis on the fate of the East Central European countries themselves to, in a sense, using the East Central Europeans as warning examples to the peoples of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and so on. And with that, I would open it to the audience. And again, Anya, there are some questions in the chat if you would want to address those there. And audience members are free to add their own questions, whether by chat or orally.
Thank you very much to both of you, Sławek and Neil. Thank you, Sławek. I think that the conference you organized, which was entitled Victims or Weapons, talking about exiles in the Cold War, was the very first piece I ever published on the ACN. So, we go way back, 2001, was it 7? Neil, one thing that your remarks prompted me to think about, to consider, is the fact that ACEN and working with the exiles is just the tip of the iceberg that I was able to describe today. And just since you mentioned Latin America, the Christian Democratic International, the Christian Democrats in general in exile, being mobilized to promote a different version, which would be less leftist than we see in the Latin American countries. That's another trait. And Sławek and Piotr Kosicki are working, Piotr and Wolfram Kaiser have been spending years and years working on these issues. So these different internationals, different organizations, I could go on, but since the topic is the ACN, I should probably stop here. If anyone is interested, I would gladly share the literature on these other initiatives and follow up with you later. If you ever need to find me, it's easy to find my address, email address. So I'm easy to contact. I might respond after 2 days, but I will respond, I promise. Now, let me answer the questions we have from the audience. And Mark Dillon is writing, how important to the ACN were the US congressional hearings and the efforts of the National Captive Nations Committee in 61, 62, and the testimony provided by such groups as the Polish American Congress? Well, the ACN was very careful not to be associated officially with the official efforts to influence the American Congress, because they were not American citizens, because by working within the framework of Free Europe Committee, they were not supposed to be involved in influencing American politics, which is all that they wanted to do. And this is what they did, but not officially. So were these important? Yes, they were. Was the initiative taken in the United States Congress to proclaim the 3rd week in July, the Captive Nations Week, important? Sure it was. Did they contribute to the marketing, to the spreading of information? Yes. Were they ever the witnesses? Were they ever heard by the US Congress? Yes, they were. But when there was an investigation on the communist takeover, for example, they were contributing their testimonies. But officially, their contacts were limited, not in the open, as not to be accused of mingling in American politics. What they did is they had very personal, almost private contacts with individual congressmen, Senator Flood, for example, or mentioned before, Senator Dodd. In the archival collection of the ACN, there's a whole set of correspondence. And it's most of it is, of course, thank you for your letter, thank you for your brochure, we appreciate your contact, but some of them are, thank you for your letter. I have spoken on this on the Congress floor. Here's the clipping from the congressional record, and you know, I delivered, right? So you asked me to do it, it's in the congressional record, done. So this was a way around these obstacles, these problems. And only now did I remember that Sławek also mentioned that I should probably comment a little bit on the files, on the archives, and how difficult and how widespread they are. Sorry, I forgot, I have it noted here. I thought that it's going to be so easy. I'm just going to go through the archival collection of the ACEN, which is in Minnesota, Immigration History Research Center. I will read through 168 boxes and I will know the story, then I will just situate it in the context and done. Well, this was in 2007 and 8. And I went page by page through entire collection, and I was definitely not done. First thing, there was no beginning. The collection seemed somehow sanitized. I didn't know why did it end up in Minneapolis. I didn't know who and when created this organization. I got to know their entire vast material, including collecting all of the issues, which is very rare, from one to the last one, from 1955, where the first issue of the ACN News was published in 1972, I was able to read through all of their publications, except for 94, which I had to borrow. But this was amazing, except for the fact it was hanging out there with absolutely no context. Without the Hoover archives, without a thorough research in the corporate files of the Free Europe Committee, I would have known nothing. And yet still it was not complete because I needed some sort of a guidance. Because in order to make sense of some of these documents, in order to be able to see behind what kind of political connections there are, what is this advisory committee, I needed a guide. And I was so lucky and so blessed to be able to work with John Foster Like, who was in charge of the Exile Relations Department from 1950 to 1960. He met with me, we corresponded, we had a number of chats over the phone. He was the first one to let me in. Then I thought, what a pity that I cannot really talk to the exiles. I was able to talk to Janusz Horvat, but he was too young. But then I said, I was so lucky to have twice spent considerable amount of time with Zofia Kokbońska. Stefan Kokboński was extremely important in the works of the assembly. So I spoke and I worked with her. And then Ross Johnson finally agreed to talk to me after 5 years of me chasing him from conference to conference. He wouldn't talk to me. Finally, he did. Eventually, he ended up writing a blurb for my book. He was instrumental in me piecing the story together. Wonderful advice, assistance. He even helped me to file a FOIA request for releasing of the ACN files from the CIA. I know that the materials, I filed my FOIA request in 2010. I see on their webpage that the materials have been received from the agency. If I'm gonna ever see them, I still don't know. And this is 2021 today, right? I'm mentioning Ross especially because he passed away last year, which is very difficult for me to believe. He became a very close friend, but we really miss him in our little world of researchers in the Free Europe Committee history. Now, Alexander Avramchuk has got 2 questions for me. Were there any attempts to include Ukraine in the ACN framework, specifically on the part of Lev Dobryansky? Of course, yeah. And I didn't see connections. I didn't see correspondence with Roman Smolstotsky. I did see a lot of attempts, and I actually had a friend help me check the Lev Dobryansky collection, whether from his end there was any correspondence related to the ACN. It was never a close cooperation. United Ukrainian Congress of America was always on the radar of the ACN. Many times representatives of the Ukrainian political diaspora would be present at the event, sometimes greatly offended, sometimes leaving the plenary session of the ACN because the map of the captive nations that the ACN used would not have Ukraine listed as the captive nations, but just as a part of Soviet Union. And this was found unacceptable by the Ukrainians. There were different moments. I think Dmytro Halichin, when he was in charge of the Ukrainian National Committee, Congress of America, the cooperation was closest. But the reason why it was not officially established was the United States policy. The United States denoted the captive nations as the countries that were independent in 1939, which that's why they included the Baltic states, excluded Yugoslavia. And it's interesting because originally there was a Yugoslav committee, and within the, say, Peasant International, there were prominent leaders who were sponsored, Maciek, Mihak, like others, of different national groups within Yugoslavia who cooperated. You know, after all, Free Europe Committee supported the king, right? Paid stipends to Peter Karađorđević. But they never were allowed within the framework which would be officially grounded and rooted in American policy. There were different programs for the countries that were seized by Soviet Russia. And this, of course, was American Committee for the Liberation of the peoples of Russia. And Amkomlib, of course, sponsored Radio Liberty. So this was a different path, as there were no representatives of East German state, right? So it's a different section in American thinking of their psychological warfare programs. I hope this answers. I'll be very happy to follow up on you with you, Alexander. Now, your second question is, would you please elaborate on George Kennan's attitude to ASEAN activities? In his memoirs, he distanced himself. How fun. You know, here is a man who says communism is going to collapse from 5 to 7 years. And back then, you know, this is 1947. And then in 1990s, he says, well, I was basically right. I just, you know, I was wrong. I was off by some years. And in the meantime, during the Vietnam War, he'll say, no, I never intended for that. George Kennan, without joking here, a brilliant strategist, a brilliant intellectual, the father of policy of containment, in March 1948, within the policy planning staff, proposes a memorandum called Inauguration of Psychological Warfare. And in this memorandum, the subtitle says the utilization of the Soviet, I'm quoting from memory, of Soviet emigrants, Soviet exiles in the American national interest. It is him who proposes the establishment of the freedom committees. It is him who proposes clandestine operations, influencing the outcome of the elections as the result we will see in Italy and in France. It is him who puts in actions programs which will have a tragic turn sometimes. So on the one hand, we have Kennan as a father of, you know, stopping communism, exercising diplomatic, economic pressure from the outside. On the other hand, he's the great interventionist. And boy, did he know what he was doing. Well, later he said he didn't expect the turn it took some places. But in my book, I'm actually able to quote a letter. And this is a very fascinating story because John Like, the one I mentioned before, the one who worked for Free Europe Committee, when he was writing his article for the Polish Review, published by the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences, when he was doing research for his article about how it was like to work with the exiles, he actually asked George Kennan to comment after many years on what he thought you know, these exile operations were. And he shared his correspondence with Kennan, with me. And parts of his letters are listed here in my book. I'm having a hard time finding it right now, but let me just spend 1 second. Part of the letter, if you want to see that, is also posted on the Woodrow Wilson Center's webpage because I gave it to Ross Johnson and he used it for his article on Kennan. I cannot seem to find it. I will be happy to scan a page and send it to you. Basically, Kennan's reaction was that had it not been for the United States, all of their had it not been for the creation of the Free Europe Committee, there would have been absolutely no one to take care of the exiles, and all of this potential, all of this capital would have been lost. Well, I'm sorry, I cannot find it really fast. I'm looking through the footnote, which is usually the fastest way, but all I can see is Laszlo Varga and Kolboński. Yeah, here it is. Okay, I found it, sorry. In a letter written in response to who was asking for an interview, Kennan wrote, I feel that much injustice has been done in sections of American opinion to those of you who took upon themselves this difficult and often thankless task. Suppose the Free Europe Committee had never been set up at all, as we must suppose many of its critics would have liked. What would have been the results? Would there not have been on the part of these refugees a general sense of coldness, indifference, and abandonment at the hands of American society? And would that not have been exploited by the Stalinist forces then predominant in the Soviet Union and other countries? Obviously, those of you who addressed yourselves to the task of helping these people found yourselves up against the reflection of all the unsolved national and ethnic problems of Eastern Europe. But did not your efforts teach many people to put these frictions into better perspective and to recognize the importance of trying to overcome them by the means of mutual understanding and compromise? And did not some of this communicate itself, at least in some degree, back to the homelands? And that's the question we don't know the answer to yet. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. I do not see any more questions in chat. We've passed the hour mark. Is there one or possibly two more questions from the audience? If not, then I think we can all agree this has been a very lively and enlightening discussion. And our thanks go, of course, to Professor Mazurkiewicz and compliments on the appearance of her book. Thanks as well to Dr. Łukasiewicz. Sławek, you wish to say something? Or
I'm simply very glad to be here. Yes, I like all the conferences organized by Anya. I'm really unhappy I missed the last one, but you know, autumn sometimes can be quite a bad time for our health, and that's all. I'm very happy to be here. And once again, I would like to recommend this book and read all the text by Anya. You can learn a lot about exiles and maybe not only about them. Great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Erdmans, did I see a hand up there? No.
No, I actually have a question, but I think it's too long of a discussion. So I think maybe we've gone over time already. So maybe I'll just privately send my question to Dr. Mazurkiewicz.
All right. I have two brief comments in closing. First, apart from thanking you all for, presenters as well as audience for your participation today. Our next PAHA webinar is scheduled for Saturday, December 11th, and that will be a joint appearance by Dr. Beata Halicka, who is a professor of history at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland, and Z. Anthony Kruszewski, who is professor of political science emeritus at the University of Texas, El Paso. And that will focus on a discussion of Professor Halicka's book, Borderlands Biography, Z. Anthony Kruszewski in wartime Europe and post-war America. Notices and details of that will be going out shortly. And I will also mention that the annual meeting of the Polish American Historical Association is scheduled to be held in New Orleans, January 6th through 8th, upcoming, in conjunction with the annual conference of the American Historical Association. Several of the people in the audience today appear on the program, and we hope that we will be able to hold the conference in person this year. That is the current plan. And we will keep our members and our friends notified as to any developments in that. But here's hoping that we will be able to meet many of you in New Orleans. With that, again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you to our audience. Dziękuję za obecność and good day or good evening.